Amazing discoveries in lost cities of the dead. Oh, to hold history in your hands. This piece of pottery I hold in my hands is very special to me. It's special to me for two reasons. Number one, it's because this is the first piece of pottery I ever owned. My wife and her family bought this for me for a Christmas present, around 30 years ago. And so for me, it's very, very precious because of that. One has to wonder if my wife isn't a little bit sorry she started this when you look at my large collection out in the foyer. But it's a symbol of her love to me. But it's also very, very special to me because this piece of pottery is 3,800 years old. And it's just in beautiful condition. And when I hold it, I think somehow I'm transported back in time. And I'm connected with the woman who used this in her kitchen almost 4,000 years ago. When I hold these items, I somehow feel like I now have become part of their history. Oh, to walk on the places where history has been made, to touch the rocks, to cry out with messages from the past, to visit the sites and the spots that have been hallowed in our memories by wonderful biblical events. Jerusalem, Jericho, Masada, Pompeii, all have their stories to tell, and they whisper their tales as you walk through their ancient ruins. Oh, to hold history in your heart, to learn its great lessons, its successes, its failures. A Spanish writer named George Santayana said, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Tonight, we'll learn eternal lessons from history and search out meaning from the sands of the past. But first, let me tell you about the eternal land, Egypt. Let me give you a short introduction to Egypt, the country. The political boundaries of Egypt lie in the northeast corner of Africa. Its official name is the Arab Republic of Egypt. It became a republic in 1953. An ancient Greek historian named Herodotus, I like to listen to a guy named Bob Breyer who calls Herodotus a Greek tourist who was traveling around. And when he visited Egypt in about 440 BC, he said these words, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile." And you can see, this is actual satellite imagery showing the green strip that follows Egypt up to the delta where it extends itself out almost like a hand. Egypt is the Nile. It's actually possible, I've done this, it's actually possible to stand with 1 foot in greenery and 1 foot in the sand. The line of demarcation is so strong, and it all has to do with the water of the Nile River. You can't go to Egypt without having a little fun to go sailing on the Nile in a little boat called a felucca. You can see that at this particular time, we're not sailing, we're rowing. And the guy there with the hat on, he's really not a lot of help, unfortunately. But it was so much fun to go boating on the Nile. The Nile River was the superhighway of ancient Egypt. It was the way everyone got around from north to south. And so you have to understand something about getting around in ancient Egypt on the Nile River. The Nile is a strange river. It's the largest river in the world that flows from south to north. Now, the ancients had no concept that we have of a map and had no concept of our planet from outer space. You know, when we talk about going up, we go up to New York, we go down to Florida, right? We go up, it's north, we go down, it's south.
That's not the way it was in ancient Egypt. They named Upper and Lower Egypt based on the flow of the Nile River, which goes from south to north. And so it seems strange to us, but southern Egypt is actually called Upper Egypt. And northern Egypt is called Lower Egypt. It's opposite of how we might think, but it's because it was all dependent upon the flow of the Nile River. Egyptian history is very long. It was first divided into dynasties by a man named Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest, lived about 300 BC. And Manetho put 31 dynasties together to make the history of ancient Egypt. The first dynasty starts in about 3100 BC, and its ruler was a man named Menes or Narmer. Some of you have heard him by both names. The last dynasty that Manetho did was the 31st dynasty. And it's the last dynasty because it's about 300 BC, because that's the time period in which he lived. And so 31 dynasties, and basically a good rule of thumb is that a dynasty is a ruling family of ancient Egyptian history. And so when a new family came upon the scene, there was a new dynasty. Now that's not totally true because Manetho was not totally perfect in his reconstruction of ancient history. But it's the best one we have, and so that's what we use today. Now I don't have time to tell you about 2,800 years of Egyptian history in about an hour. And so I've chosen to center in on two of the strongest and most fascinating periods of Egyptian history. The Old Kingdom and, appropriately enough, the New Kingdom. They weren't very creative when they named these, right? And this wasn't the ancient Egyptians that did this. This was modern scholars. So we're going to look at the Old Kingdom tonight and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is famous because it's the age of the pyramids. There are more than 110 of them, and every pharaoh of the 4th and 5th dynasties in the Old Kingdom built a pyramid. Now, most of the pyramids are, as I say, from the Old Kingdom period, although there are some Middle Kingdom pyramids that are really quite pathetic. They were made out of mud brick instead of stone, and they're really very unremarkable. And so the real pyramid period is the Old Kingdom. There are more than 110 of them. This is actually the first pyramid, not the first true pyramid, but the first pyramid made by a king named Dozier. And they're up and down the Nile River. Interestingly enough, all of them are on the west bank of the Nile River, none on the east bank. It's because the west bank was considered the place of burial. And so all the pyramids are on the west bank of the Nile. Now you have to understand something about ancient Egypt to understand the purpose of the pyramids. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was God. Period. The people were benefited by keeping Pharaoh happy. They had an old saying back in Egypt: if Pharaoh ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. I'm not sure that's true, but. So Pharaoh had to be kept happy, and so the purpose of the economy of the ancient Egyptians in the Old Kingdom period was to keep Pharaoh happy. Pharaoh administers for his own benefit, and the people are benefited if Pharaoh is happy, because if Pharaoh is happy, then he maintains order in the land. The Nile River floods like it's supposed to. There's prosperity in the land. And so literally when the pharaoh came upon the throne, they began building his pyramid, which was probably a burial place. But I've often thought it was strange, if Pharaoh is a god, how do you bury a god? And so perhaps they weren't really intended to be burial places, at least places for his mortal remains to be. But I think they were really a much higher purpose, and that was to to honor the God King when he was buried there. Perhaps there's no better symbol of ancient Egypt, unless it's a mummy, than the pyramids of Egypt. They are essentially Egyptian. Now, I had the privilege of being in Egypt in 2008. I had a goal while I was in Egypt to walk around. I had two goals. One was to walk around as many pyramids as I could. And number two was to climb into as many pyramids as I could. Now, some of you may say, why did you want to do that? At least on the walking part. I wanted to walk around as many pyramids as I could. I walked around about 10 of them. I was traveling with a friend of mine, Greg, who's not here tonight, so I can pick on him. When I told Greg I wanted to walk around the pyramids, he said this to me. He said, well, I kind of am of the opinion that if you've seen one side, you've seen all four. Short-sighted, very short-sighted. So he didn't walk around with me when I walked around all these pyramids, and I couldn't get all the way around all of them because some of them were prohibited territory. But in actual fact, at the Bent Pyramid, he missed something. The Bent Pyramid's interesting because they got it half built and it started falling apart, so they made it shallower, and it's just a very distinctive look. It's at Dashur. And on the back of the pyramid, on the third side of the pyramid, when I was walking around the pyramid, I discovered at the base of the pyramid these casing stones. I'll talk to you a little bit more about casing stones in a little while. So you know what? Greg didn't get to see the casing stones. Furthermore, he didn't get to see the little auxiliary pyramid that was on the third side of the Bent Pyramid. And I'm not really sure he cared that much that he missed it. But it was fun walking around the pyramids as much as I could. I also wanted to get into as many pyramids as I could. And so I was able to climb into 5 pyramids, and I think, I'm not sure you can get into many more than that, so I probably got into all of them that are really safe to get into. The 5 I got to get into was the first one, and I've given these because of the way my brain thinks. I've given these in chronological order as to how they were built, not in the order of which I got into them. So the first one I visited, or the one I visited, is the Red Pyramid, which is at Dashur, very close to the Bent Pyramid. It's very fascinating. Inside, there's this wonderful burial chamber with what's called a corbelled ceiling. You can see how they made each row of stones just a little bit further in, and it was able to handle the load of all the rock up on top of it. Built by a guy, a pharaoh whose name is Senefru. The second pyramid in time that I visited, in chronological time, is the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And we're going to come back to that in a little while. The third pyramid I got into in time is the Pyramid of Khafre, which sits right next to the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was built by Khufu's son or brother. The family lines are a little bit unclear as to which it is. It was built by the guy whose face you see on the Great Sphinx, Khephren. The next pyramid I got into was a very small pyramid. It's over on the side. It's called one of the Queen's Pyramids. I don't think there's any evidence that the queens were actually buried here. But in ancient Egypt, when they made a statue of the king, he was about 20 feet tall. The queen was about this big at his feet. I didn't do it, women. Don't blame me for this. So I think they just saw these big pyramids for the kings, and somebody said, that's probably where they buried the queens. And so they call these the Queen's Pyramids, but I don't think they are. But Khufu's mother, who was the wife of Senefru, was reburied. She was first buried in another place at Saqqara, but she was reburied in this small auxiliary pyramid on the Giza plain, and I was able to go down into this pyramid. And her burial chamber is way down underground. It's not actually up in the pyramid. And then here is this. Yes, that's a pyramid. Looks like a hill, doesn't it? It's just so ruined. And this is a pyramid at Saqqara. And whose is it? It's very plain, isn't it? It's the pyramid of Teti, and that's his cartouche on the pyramid wall. I'm taking this picture in a side structure or side chamber of his pyramid. The whole burial chamber is covered with these wonderful hieroglyphs. And I'm taking this picture without my flash as the guard in the next chamber is saying, "No photos! No photos!" I don't speak Egyptian. Oh, that was English. So this is Teti's pyramid. It's hard to understand, it's hard to see on a typical day which one is the Great Pyramid. When they take you to Giza to see the three pyramids, actually there are more than that on the Giza plain, I'll tell you in a second. But when you see the big three pyramids, it's hard to know which one is the Great Pyramid, because the one in the middle looks like the Great Pyramid, right? It's the biggest. But that's simply because of perspective. The one on the left is actually further away, so it looks smaller. The one on the right is actually quite small. It's the one of Menkaure. And so the one in the middle, from the vantage point they let you take pictures, looks like it's the Great Pyramid, but it's not. And this is how I usually tell. This is the rule of thumb I use. On that middle pyramid, the top has all these casing stones still on it. It looks great. Its condition is great. And so the one that looks great is not. It works for me. And I'll bet it would work for you if you were there too. So the Great Pyramid is the one doesn't look great. And so on the Giza plain, as you're standing from the overview place, the one on the left is actually the pyramid of Khufu and Khafre and then Menkaure. The Great Pyramid is actually a part of a complex on the Giza plain. There are actually 9 pyramids on the Giza plain. At least that's what they used to say. Interestingly enough, just a few years ago, they were moving a parking lot on the Giza plain, and they discovered that a pyramid had been built under that parking lot. No, I said that wrong. They discovered that the parking lot had been built over a pyramid, because the pyramid was there first, you understand, right? And the pyramid was so ruined that there was only like one layer of blocks. So it was a ruined pyramid, but there is another pyramid there. So there are actually 10 pyramids on the Giza plain. And each of these pyramids had temples associated with it, had aqueducts associated with it, had valley temples. It was a whole complex. This whole area was built to honor the kings and the pharaohs in their death. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is, of course, the greatest. It dwarfs people as they stand by it. You can see that it's even one level of the stones is about as tall as a person. So it's a huge, huge pyramid. It was built by a ruler whose name was Khufu. His Greek name is Cheops. You'll see it Cheops, and Americans would be tempted to call him Cheops. But the CH in Greek is actually, you almost have to clear your throat to say that. Cheops. And so this is Khufu. And of all the ancient ruins that we've discovered, archaeologists have discovered, this is the only absolute statue of Khufu that we've ever found. He was responsible for building this great pyramid. Its dimensions, it's 481.4 feet tall. Its base covers 13 acres. It's 756 feet on each side. And so, when Franke Zollman walked around the Great Pyramid, which I did, walked around all of them on the Giza plain, when I walked around it, I walked 0.6 of a mile. As a matter of fact, in the 2 weeks that I was in Egypt, I walked around so many pyramids, I lost 10 pounds. My wife would like me to go every year to Egypt. It would help me with weight control. 0.6 of a mile around it. There are 2.5 million granite and limestone blocks used to build the Great Pyramid. And each block weighs from 2 tons to 70 tons. Huge blocks. There's more stone in the Great Pyramid alone than was used in building all the churches and chapels in England since the time of Jesus. That's how much stone there is there. Someone estimated that you could build a fence 6 feet high around the country of France. And that might not be that bad of an idea. Huge amounts of stone. 201 tiers high. How was it built? We still don't know. There are lots of theories. A new theory comes out every few years. Some believe it was built by ramps. Some believe it was built by very extensive levering. But many people believe that it was aliens. I don't subscribe to that one. We still don't know how the Great Pyramid was built. But people have been fascinated by the pyramids for many years. That classical writer that I was talking about a little while ago, Herodotus, who was there in 440 BC, that Greek tourist historian. He writes about being there and seeing the Great Pyramid. At that point in time, the pyramid was not blocky like it is today, like steps going up. It had casing stones, limestone polished casing stones on the outside. That's what it looked like when he saw it. And at the base, it's a very funny little thing that he writes about. At the base, he sees an inscription, and he asks about the inscription. And the Egyptian guide that's leading him around says, that's a record of the bread and beer that was given to the builders of the Great Pyramid. He sees this inscription. Of course, the inscription is gone today. It still, as I say, had polished limestone. Now, this must have been just an incredible sight. These white polished sides, when the sun hit them, they must have gleamed. Must have been just beautiful. We know from graffiti inside the Great Pyramid that during the Greek and Roman period, that the pyramid was open. Even though later on in the Middle Ages, I'm going to tell you in just a moment, it had been closed again. But in the Roman and Greek period, it was open because we find in the Great Pyramid graffiti. You know, people have always wanted to write their names wherever they go. Some of you will remember Kilroy was here, right? Well, that writing on the Great Pyramid in essence says Kilroy was here. It's funny how these Greek tourists visited, and there's another site called two monuments called the Colossi of Memnon. And some Greek tourists came there and wrote on the feet of the Colossus of Memnon something like this: I came here, I saw this, and I wasn't impressed. But they didn't say that about the Great Pyramid. There's very little interest for most of the first, after the Greek period, very little interest until about the year AD 800. In AD 820, an Arab sheikh by the name of Al-Mamun comes to the area to investigate the Great Pyramid. He brings with him a whole conglomeration of architects and engineers to study the Great Pyramid. It's not for scientific purposes. His purpose in studying the Great Pyramid was treasure hunting. The legend was that inside the Great Pyramid there was a great treasure. And so he brought these people to study the Great Pyramid to try to find their way inside the Great Pyramid to discover the treasure. At that point in time, the pyramid was again closed up. At this point in time, it still had all that limestone casing on the outside, so it didn't look like it does today. It was quite smooth on the sides. And they examined all that they could of the pyramid and could not find a way in. And so, if he could not find a way in, Al-Mamun decided to make a way in. Now, it's unclear in my mind what Al-Mamun really intended to do. There were some legends around about the Great Pyramid, about the pyramids in general. Some people believe that the pyramids were from the biblical time of Joseph. And do you remember Joseph in the Bible? Some of you remember the story. Joseph was charged with making great storehouses for Pharaoh's grain. And it's possible that many people thought the pyramids were actually hollow. So whether or not Al-Mamun thought that or not, I don't know. But he began tunneling into the Great Pyramid. Because they didn't have really hard metal picks and stuff, and it was such hard going, they had a very ingenious way of making their way in. They built a fire on the edge of the pyramid, and when the stones got superheated, they threw water on them. Or some accounts say they threw vinegar on them. How in the world they came up with that much vinegar, I have no idea. But they threw liquid on them. And when you throw the liquid on the superheated rocks, they cracked. And then they would take pickaxes, pick out all the cracked rock, and then repeat that process over and over and over again. He went 100 feet into the Great Pyramid. You can see his hole right here. This is Al-Mamun's forced hole. 100 feet. I've often thought about what it would be like to build a fire 100 feet in a tunnel like that. I mean, how would it burn? And how could the people who were building the fire breathe? Unbelievable. And he tunneled his way in 100 feet, and he hit a passageway. I told you this is 756 feet on each side. 13 acres. And he tunnels in 100 feet, and he hits a passage. His next stop should have been Vegas. Luck. What unbelievable luck. He stumbled in and found first, let me go back here. First he found this passage, and he went up the passage and found the original entrance. He went then down the passage, and at the very way down here, I call it the basement of the pyramid, he found an empty, unfinished room. And so he came back up out of there, and he saw this little passageway going up here. It was blocked with granite that was so hard it dulled his picks. But somehow they instead of going through the granite, the granite plugs, they went around them and found this ascending passage. And this kind of gives you a figure of how they would have come in. The first thing is they came up the ascending passage, they came over and they found the Queen's chamber. I think this would have been so cool. Would any of you like to join me on that? Bats flying over your head, you know. The first passage they found was the Queen's chamber, totally empty. They left the Queen's chamber and went on up the ascending passage and hit this, which is called the Grand Gallery. It is, in essence, a corbelled Grand Gallery, because you can see how each course of stone is in just a little bit further. And this huge, tall ceiling. It is an incredible place to visit. This is lit. Imagine what it must have looked like with a torch. Unbelievable. What incredible exploration. Finally, this Grand Gallery led up into the King's chamber, and this is what they found in the King's chamber. An empty sarcophagus with the corner broken off. Obviously, it was robbed, and the rest of the room was totally empty. By the way, any of you ever been in the Great Pyramid too? Cool, good. A few of you have been there. This is all they found. There was no treasure whatsoever. The legend is that the workmen were so upset that had gone digging into this pyramid so far, they were so upset, and wouldn't you be, that Al-Mamun actually had gold brought from somewhere else and had it hidden in the Great Pyramid so his workmen could find it. There's little interest in the Great Pyramid for another 1,000 years about, except for that the interest in the Great Pyramid was not scientific. The interest in the Great Pyramid was because of its stone. Remember, I've told you about this beautiful polished limestone that covers the whole Great Pyramid, 22 acres of this beautiful polished limestone. If you want to see it today, you go into the old city of Cairo, you go to the old mosques that are built in the old sections of Cairo. What did they do? They went out to the Great Pyramid. They didn't think history, they thought building material. And they stole all this white limestone off the Great Pyramid and took it into Cairo and built the mosques that you can still see there today. This is what an old kingdom burial might have looked like. Was Cheops ever buried there? We don't know. We just know it was empty. Was it a real burial place, or was it simply a place of memoriam? We don't know. The first really modern scientific inquiry into the Great Pyramid came from a source that might surprise you. It came from Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte was in Egypt on crusade to conquer Egypt in his attempt to conquer the world. He led an army there, but when he led an army to Egypt, Napoleon Bonaparte took a whole group of scholars, artists, took a group who were engineers and architects, and they scoured the countryside and studied the antiquities. There are some interesting stories about how the scholars are dodging bullets when they're measuring these antiquities. Not usually what you think of a scholarly endeavor. Napoleon Bonaparte fought a battle in the shadow of the Great Pyramid. 25,000 Frenchmen against 78,000 Egyptians. And Napoleon Bonaparte's troops won. 25,000 against 78,000. It is said, this is legend at least, that after the battle, Napoleon Bonaparte pointed back to the pyramids and said, "Gentlemen, 40 centuries look down upon you." Now it's interesting to me, how did he know that? 40 centuries would be 4,000 years. At the time of Napoleon, the Great Pyramid is about 4,500 years old. Napoleon is not that far off. So it's really quite surprising that he would be that close to knowing how big or how long the Great Pyramid had been there. Napoleon did something else really important while he was in Egypt. Actually, he didn't, but his soldiers did. They found this stone. It's called, do you know? The Rosetta Stone. Let's see, I've got to think about it. 1 week from tonight, I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on the Rosetta Stone and tell you why it is so important to the study of archaeology. But we'll save that for another time. Further scientific study of the Great Pyramid was done in the late 1800s by a guy named, by a group of men. The first one was a guy named John Taylor. He was a mathematician. He came to the Great Pyramid and measured it and became convinced that it was built on the principle, on the value of pi. And he said the Egyptians were too dumb to know to do that. And so, those ancient guys, no way they could have understood pi. And so he concluded that it was divinely appointed. In other words, the Great Pyramid was a God thing. Came along another guy whose name was C. Piazza Smith, who also studied the Great Pyramid. He was also a mathematician, a Scotsman, and he wrote a book about the Great Pyramid, and he concluded that not only was the Great Pyramid divinely appointed, he actually writes this. He says, in the Great Pyramid, the world now possesses a monument of inspiration as it has long possessed a book of inspiration. So C. Piazza Smith compares the Great Pyramid with the Bible, a monument of inspiration. And it came to him and another man named Robert Menzies, who measured the Great Pyramid. They came up with this scheme of how 1 pyramid inch equals 1 year of solar time. And so if you go up to this certain passage, it foretold that this certain event would happen in world history. And if you went up to this passage, it could foretell the future. Interesting. A monument of inspiration. So God could give us messages. A man named Sir Flinders Petrie came along and debunked all of it and exposed these 3 guys for what they'd been doing. They had been fudging their measurements just a little bit. And so it was really not true. I'd like you to think, though, what is the Great Pyramid? When you go there today, you're struck by its size. You go into this hole that was forced in by Al-Mamun. You go up to the king's chamber, up through this wonderful grand gallery. You can also, back when I went the first time, went to the Great Pyramid, you go way down into what I call the basement. You can't go there anymore. When I was just there in 2008, they forbid you to go down there anymore. But I was able to go down there. This is what the passageway looks like going down. Actually, that's coming out. It's very, you walk like this. If you're claustrophobic, don't try it. I'm not claustrophobic, but I got claustrophobic a little bit here, and in the other pyramid, the Khafre pyramid, I got really claustrophobic in there. I never get claustrophobic. So you're climbing up out of this pyramid, out of the basement, up this 370 feet ramp. You're looking up ahead. All you can see is a little patch of sky. When I came out, I was sweating. And then finally, you get out to the very top, and you see Cairo out before you. It's an impressive monument. But what's it to? What's it to? To a God king who we don't even know if he was buried there. And it's probable that all the resources of building these pyramids is what actually caused the old kingdom to fail. All the resources of the state were going into building these huge monuments that really helped no one. And so it probably caused the end of the old kingdom. I want you to think for a second. Imagine in your mind's eye a young man named Moses standing in the shadows of this great structure. By then, they are already 1,000 years old. And Moses knows, because he has been adopted into Pharaoh's family, that when you're Pharaoh in Egypt, this is how they treat you. I want you to fly forward with me in time for 1,000 years. The annual flooding of the Nile has continued. 13 dynasties have passed. The time of the pyramid builders is now ancient history, and this is the new kingdom. And the pharaohs are no longer buried in these mammoth crypts that no one could guard, that could not keep their secrets. As a matter of fact, the great pyramids, or the pyramids themselves, were hulking "rob me" signs. Now, most people have never seen this. You have to catch the light just right on the Great Pyramid. Did you see that? Not everybody sees that. I mean, they go by real fast. If the light just switches by there, rob me. And you know, that's what they did. And probably the people that robbed the pyramids were probably the very guys that built the pyramids, because they knew how to get in. And so because of the problem with the pyramids being robbed, they came up with a new idea: burial in a central valley where they could protect all the burials. And so they came up with something called the Valley of the Kings. This is the New Kingdom, about 1500 BC. In the Valley of the Kings, there are some 62 known tombs. But the problem was, each and every single one of them was being plundered. Every one, when archaeologists got there, had been plundered in antiquity. And like I say, probably by the very ones who had built them in the first place. We actually have some interesting, from the New Kingdom period, we actually have some interesting papyrus, which tells about trials of tomb robbers who robbed the pharaoh's tombs. It actually has transcripts of the trials. Very, very interesting. Probably by the very ones who built them. But in one discovery, in 1922, we discovered all that we needed to know about what it meant to be buried in the Valley of the Kings. That year, a secret that had been kept for 3,265 years was revealed. It was a man named Howard Carter who came to the Valley of the Kings looking for Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, many people don't understand that this was not dumb luck. Howard Carter had done his research. He'd gone to the library. He'd studied all the excavation reports of all the people who'd excavated in the valley. He had mapped out every single spot in the valley that had been dug to bedrock. He knew in the valley there were only a few places that the Tut's tomb could possibly be hidden. And so he began systematically digging for that spot. He had come within it just a few years before, just feet within it, a few years before, but because he found a huge pile of rubble that he didn't want to move, and because he found some old workmen's huts, and he didn't think workmen would build their huts on a tomb, he abandoned his search. But this was one of the few spots left to look. And so he started his efforts again in this area. When Carter arrived in the valley on the morning of November 4, 1922, it was unusually quiet. It was a Saturday. Usually when they're digging, it's noisy because their pickaxes are hitting the stones and they're ringing out. And the Arab workmen have this way of singing when they were working. But it was absolutely dead quiet. They came to him and said it's because they have found a step cut into the rock going down. So as they began to excavate and dig out the steps, they came to the bottom. And there they found a door that was plastered over, and they found this seal. This is the seal of the royal necropolis. It was a royal tomb. They found it. Perhaps. So they recovered the steps so no one could get in before them. Howard Carter telegraphed to Lord Carnarvon, who was back in England, and told him, "Come quickly, have found great discovery in the valley." It took 3 weeks for Lord Carnarvon to get to Egypt, and 3 weeks, that would have been so hard to wait, wouldn't it? 3 weeks. But finally, on the day of November 26, 1922, Carter writes this. He says, "This was the most wonderful day I've ever lived through, and certainly one whose like I can never hope to see again." He writes of this day in the opening of the tomb. And I just want to read you just this passage, because I think it's one of the most beautiful passages ever written in archaeological writing. He writes this: "Slowly, Desperately slowly, it seemed to us as we watched, the remains of passage debris that encumbered the lower part of the doorway was removed until at last we had the whole door clear before us. The decisive moment had arrived. With trembling hands, I made a tiny breach in the upper left-hand corner. Darkness and blank space, as far as an iron testing rod could reach, showed that whatever lay beyond was empty and was not filled like the passage we had just cleared. Candle tests were applied as a precaution against possible foul gases, and then, widening the hole a little, I inserted the candle and peered in. Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, and Calendar, standing anxiously beside me to hear the verdict. At first I could see nothing, the hot air escaping from the chamber, causing the candle to flicker. But presently, as my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. For a moment, an eternity it must have seemed to the others standing by, I was struck dumb with amazement. And when Lord Carnarvon, unable to stand the suspense any longer, inquired anxiously, "Can you see anything?" It's all I could do to get out the words, "Yes, wonderful things." That may be the archaeological understatement of history. Fantastic, incredible things, Yes, wonderful things. I want to just show you a few pictures, and I'm going to talk about Tutankhamun in depth another night. But I just want to show you just a few pictures of the wonders that Howard Carter found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Another night I'll tell you more about the details of what these ancient items meant. But aren't they just beautiful? Have some of you seen them in the Cairo Museum in Cairo? I've been there twice. And I saw the mask when it was here in the United States, in Chicago, I think it was, many, many years ago. It'll never leave Egypt again. These beauties are unrivaled and unparalleled. And all this for a king, a pharaoh, who was relatively minor. He only reigned for about 10 years, from 1333 to 1323 BC. He came upon a throne when he was 8 years old and died, some think under mysterious circumstances, maybe from an accident. Died at the time he was 18. And yet these treasures were buried in his tomb. One has to wonder what the tombs of the great pharaohs looked like. And yet his remains were pitiful. They're still in his tomb today. What must the tombs of the great pharaohs look like? the one like Ramses who ruled over 50 years. What must his tomb have been like? It took 9 years to remove the treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb. 5,000 wonderful treasures that he discovered. 9 years. It's a particular area that I'm interested in because I believe this is the time where Moses fits into ancient Egyptian history. Now, we don't find the biblical Moses, in ancient Egyptian records. But I believe that the Bible tells us that this is where he fits. And I'll show you why. When Moses was there, his grandfather was probably buried in the Valley of the Kings. And Moses understood that when you're Pharaoh in Egypt, this is how you were treated, like a god. Let me share with you a few texts that show why I come up with the idea that Moses belongs to this time period. The first text, 1 Kings 6:1. It says, in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. Here's a very interesting chronological biblical text. It says that from the time of the Exodus until the 4th year of the reign of Solomon was 480 years. Now, if we knew what the 4th year of Solomon's reign was, then we could do some adding, right? And of course, you probably realize that if I didn't think we knew, I wouldn't bring it up. And so that's true. We have, actually a scholar named Thiele has concluded that the 4th year of Solomon's reign was 970 BC. When you add 480 years, because it was 480 years from the 4th year of Solomon's reign back to the Exodus, when you add 480 years, you come up with a date of the Exodus as 1450 BC. Another piece of information. It says Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. So Moses was 80 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. So when you add 80 years to 1450 BC, you learn that Moses was born in 1530 BC. Now, I've got to tell you that what I am sharing today is based on the research of a man named Bill Shea, and this is not the currently commonly accepted belief about the Pharaoh of the Exodus and the oppression. The common belief amongst most people is, have you seen the 10 Commandments at Easter? That the Pharaoh of the oppression the Pharaoh of the Exodus was a man named Yul Brynner. No, I'm sorry. Was a man named Ramses. Ramses was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And I tell you, it's difficult for me to think about Moses. In my mind, he'll always look like Charlton Heston. Right? I've seen that movie so many times. That's the current belief, is that Ramses was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But I believe it was a man named Tutmosis III. And his father would have been reigning in 1530 BC when Moses was born. And so he would have been the one who made this terrible death decree in Exodus 1:22. It says, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. The Pharaoh of the Exodus, the Pharaoh of the oppression, 1530 BC, that made this was probably a man named Tutmosis I. Now, Tutmosis I is very interesting because he had a daughter whose name was Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut had no male heir. It was very interesting how you became Pharaoh in ancient Egypt. You didn't become Pharaoh based on who your daddy was. It was called matrilinear. You became Pharaoh based on who your mother was. The old phrase, who's your mama? It was really back then. Who's your mama? So it's matrilinear, and so it was important who the woman, who the man's mother was. And Hatshepsut was the princess, and she had no male heir. And so you remember this story about how there were these two slaves, Amram and Jochebed, and they had a little boy, and they didn't want to throw him into the river for the crocodiles to eat. And so instead, they hid him for 3 months. He either got too big or got too loud. But they decided to do something, or perhaps God just revealed to them what he wanted them to do. And so they made a basket out of rushes, made it watertight. When my kids were small, we called it the basket boat. Made it watertight and put Moses out on the Nile River. Miriam, his sister, stayed close by to see what would happen. Someone came down to the river. It was Pharaoh's daughter, who I believe was Hatshepsut. She saw the child. She had no male heir. She understood its meaning, and she adopted him into her family. Oh, what he must have experienced when he was there. This says this in Acts 7:21. It says, when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. You know what I find really fascinating is we do not know how the pyramids were built. Moses did. He was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. He would have understood. He was being prepared to rule Egypt. He knew of the Valley of the Kings, the royal burial place of his grandfather. He had become part of the most magnificent civilization the world had ever known. He passed by the shadow of the great Sphinx. He saw the splendors that we can only guess of because of their ruins. Eventually, he would occupy the royal throne. All power, all wealth would be his. It was his for the taking. The palace of Pharaoh at Memphis would be his home. The Valley of the Kings would be his final resting place. He would be enshrined in gold and treasure like King Tut. Buried, wrapped in hundreds of yards of fine linen, waiting for a modern day plunderer like Howard Carter or Franke Zollman to come dig him up. I'm hitting the wrong button. I apologize. There we go. Got to know my left hand from my right hand. But no one ever found the underground burial chamber of Moses. There is no mummy of Moses. There's no tomb painting with his name. No golden death mask. There are no temples with his name carved in the royal cartouche. There are no temples with his exploits carved on its walls. There are no statues that bear his likeness. His tomb was never built because he never became Pharaoh. Moses made a different, difficult choice. In Hebrews, it talks about Moses, and it says this. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, for a time. Moses made a different choice. The world was his. And yet, because of his heritage, his nationality, his bloodlines, and because of his God, he turned his back on it all. Wow. That's an amazing thought to me. The man who could have been king of the world chose rather to suffer with his people and to follow his God. The choices that Moses made speak to us today and challenge us to think of our own priorities. Many of us are reasonably happy in life and successful and relatively satisfied with where we're living, what we're doing. Ask this question: is there anything in this world that could get you to turn away from it, to make a major change in your lifestyle? Is there any cause that could cause you to follow it at the detriment of your life? Do you believe in anything that strongly? Or how's your relationship with God? What if God asked you to change your life to follow him in a way that was different than what you've been following him? Would you do that? Or would the treasures of the world, the treasures that culture can offer, would they be too strong a pull for you? I have this saying that I like. It says, if you don't have anything to really live for, you don't have any real reason to live. You know, sometimes we live our lives just kind of let life go by. But you know, there are so many things, so many needs around us that we could help with. We could be a service in. What do I mean by the idea that if we don't have anything to really live for, we don't have a reason to live? Well, I mean having something in life that gives life meaning. There are so many needs around us. There are so many causes worth committing yourself to. There are hungry people all around the world and in our country too. And we become comfortable with that somehow. There are homeless people in our community. Our congregation here helps at the homeless shelter up at Reach. Every year we run it for a week. Even here in Hagerstown, homeless. There are lonely people all around us. Maybe your next door neighbor's lonely. You'll never know if you don't stop and talk to them and ask. There are many people in nursing homes who never get one visit. There are children who need adopted grandparents. There are hospitals that need volunteers. Hospice always needs helpers. There are needs all around us, places where we could make a difference. Do you see them? And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, the saddest thing of all, is if they're there and we don't even see them. So many places we could help. Moses made a different choice. This text in Hebrews says, Hebrews 11, 26 and 27, Moses realized, or rather, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. He had different values. Moses understood that there are some values that are more than simply dollars and cents. Some that may not be realized here, but may not be realized till eternity. I saw this great bumper sticker many years ago. It says, serving God doesn't pay that great here, but the retirement benefits are out of this world. Moses understood that. And when I think about Moses' choices, it challenges me to think about what is really important. And it challenges me to find meaning from the sands of the past.